The Pentagon smelled of ozone and industrial-grade lemon wax. It was a scent Marcus Hale had worn like a second skin for 5 years, 3 months, and 12 days. At 2 o'clock, the building was a labyrinth of echoing limestone and fluorescent hums, a concrete hive where the world's most powerful secrets were kept behind reinforced steel. To the generals and the analysts, the secrets were the data packets and the satellite feeds. To Marcus, the secrets were the discarded whiskey bottles in a colonel's trash bin or the frantic, crumpled notes of a sleep-deprived clerk. He moved through the corridors of the earring with a practiced, deliberate invisibility. He kept his shoulders rounded, a calculated slump that shaved 2 inches off his height and hid the coiled tension in his lats. His navy blue uniform was stiff with starch, the name tag, Hale, slightly crooked. It was a costume that worked better than any ghillie suit he'd ever worn in the Hindu Kush. In this building, people looked through you, not at you. A group of junior officers hurried past him, their heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. Marcus stepped to the side, hugging the wall, his head bowed just enough to offer the illusion of deference. He was the help, a piece of living furniture that changed the liners and buffed the scuffs. One of the officers nearly brushed his shoulder, not out of malice, but because Marcus simply didn't register as an obstacle. He was a ghost in a blue jumpsuit. "Watch it, pal," the officer muttered, not even glancing back. "Sorry, sir," Marcus murmured. His voice was a soft, gravelly rasp, a sound he'd cultivated to be entirely unmemorable. He returned to his task, pushing the heavy rubberized cart toward the service elevator. The cart was his world. It contained the tools of a quiet life, a commercial-grade mop, a gallon of bleach, ammonia, a roll of heavy-duty liners, and a master key ring that felt like a lead weight against his hip. Every item had its place, a meticulous order that mirrored the tactical kits of his previous life. He knew the weight of every bottle, the exact reach of the mop handle, and the friction coefficient of the floor wax he applied to the high-traffic zones. He reached the threshold of a secure briefing room and began the routine. Empty the bin. Wipe the surface. Buff the floor. It was a form of meditation, a way to keep the predator buried under layers of domesticity. As he worked, he practiced his breathing, low, slow, and steady, keeping his heart rate at a resting 60 beats per minute. He spent his nights observing the sheep from the shadows of the maintenance closets, noting the way the security guards checked their watches and the exact timing of the door seals. He didn't want the power these men held. He wanted the opposite. He wanted to occupy as little space in the universe as possible, to be the man no one remembered when the lights went out. He had spent years scrubbing away the blood of his past, hoping that if he cleaned enough floors, he might eventually feel clean himself. The master key turned in the lock of the next suite with a satisfying, metallic click. The room was dark, the only light coming from the blinking green status LEDs on the wall-mounted servers. Marcus stepped inside, the smell of floor wax following him like a loyal dog. He didn't know that in less than an hour, the janitor's shuffle would be gone, replaced by the lethal grace of a man who knew exactly how much pressure it took to snap a human neck. For now, he just reached for the trash bin, a shadow among shadows, perfectly, beautifully overlooked. The transition from peace to war didn't start with an explosion. It started with a whisper of hydraulics. Marcus was in the sub-basement, emptying a heavy trash chute, when the air pressure in the hallway shifted. It was a subtle change, the kind only felt by someone who spent their life tuned to the heartbeat of a building. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant thrum as the massive, blast-rated security doors seated themselves into their magnetic tracks. One by one, the pneumatic seals engaged with a series of muffled thuds that vibrated through the soles of Marcus's work boots. He froze. His hand, clad in a blue nitrile glove, stayed poised over the rim of the bin. He didn't reach for a radio or a phone, he simply listened. Above him, in the primary security hub, the wolf had already entered the pen. Farid al-Zahir didn't move like a common criminal. He moved with the calibrated economy of a man who had been trained by the same institutions he was now dismantling. Within seconds, the Pentagon's nervous system had been severed. The external fiber optics were dark, the satellite uplinks scrambled, and the internal surveillance feeds were looped to show empty, pristine hallways. Farid stood over the terminal, his gloved fingers dancing across the glass. With a single keystroke, he engaged the Red Perimeter protocol. A failsafe designed to protect the building from outside chemical attacks. Now, it served a different purpose. It turned the world's most secure office building into a tomb. Marcus felt the lockdown in his gut. He stood in the dim light of the maintenance corridor, eyes narrowed. Then, he heard it. It was faint, echoing down the ventilation shaft from 3 levels up, the distinctive, sharp clack-clack of a bolt carrier group being sent home on a full magazine. It was a sound of intent. A sound that meant the sheep upstairs, the analysts, the night shift clerks, the high-value hostages, were no longer in control of their own lives. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking, but not with fear. It was the adrenaline of a dormant predator recognizing a familiar scent. For 5 years, he had tried to scrub the soldier out of his DNA with bleach and ammonia, but as the screams began to filter through the PA system, short, aborted bursts of terror, the janitor began to recede. He reached out and gripped the handle of his cleaning cart. To anyone else, it was a collection of plastic buckets and chemicals. To Marcus, it was a mobile armory waiting to be repurposed. He looked at the heavy-duty master key ring hanging from his belt. He knew every service crawlspace, every blind spot in the sensors, and every pressurized pipe in the walls. The terrorists thought they had locked the world out. They didn't realize they had trapped themselves in a 5-sided box with the one man who knew how to dismantle it from the inside out. Marcus reached up and slowly straightened his shoulders. The janitor's shuffle vanished. His spine lengthened, his chest expanded, and his gaze sharpened into something cold and predatory. He didn't head for the emergency exit. Instead, he turned his cart toward the sound of the rifles. The cleaner had a new kind of mess to attend to. The heavy silence of the Pentagon sublevels was broken only by the hum of the HVAC system. Marcus stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the reinforced steel door at the end of the utility corridor. The transformation was internal first, a chemical shift in his blood, a recalibration of his pulse. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, and when he opened them, the man who worried about floor scuffs and trash liners was gone. He reached for the Velcro strap on his navy blue sleeve, tightening it until the fabric sat flush against his forearm. He did the same for his other arm, then cinched his belt, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of his master key ring. He didn't just stand taller, his entire center of gravity seemed to shift forward. The slight, defensive shuffle he had worn for 5 years was replaced by a fluid, predatory grace. He moved now with the silent, rolling step of a man who had cleared compounds in the dark of 1,000 moons. He bypassed the main elevators, knowing the security hub, now controlled by Al-Zahir, would be tracking every car. Instead, he slipped into a maintenance hatch disguised as a wall panel. Behind it lay the bones of the building, a network of narrow catwalks and cable trays that ran like arteries through the concrete. He moved with lethal speed, his boots making no sound on the steel grating. He wasn't running, he was flowing. He climbed a vertical ladder with effortless power, his muscles remembering the tension they had been denied for half a decade. He reached a ventilation plenum overlooking the level 2 corridor, the gateway to the server rooms. Peering through the louvers of the vent, Marcus observed his first target. 2 men in tactical charcoal gray fatigues stood guard at the intersection. They were professionals. They held their rifles at a high-ready position, their eyes scanning the hallway in rhythmic arcs. They weren't looking up, and they certainly weren't looking for a janitor. Marcus watched them with the cold detachment of a mechanic looking at a broken machine. He analyzed their equipment, 416 Hong Kong dollars rifles, suppressed, sidearms in friction lock holsters, integrated comms headsets. He noted the way the shorter operative favored his left leg, shifting his weight every 30 seconds. He noted the gap in their patrol rotation, a 4-second window when both men turned their backs to each other to check the opposing corridors. A ghost was a term his old unit used for a man who could exist in a room without displacing the air. Marcus felt that familiar sensation returning, the feeling of being a phantom in a world of solid objects. He wasn't a hero coming to the rescue. He was a complication they hadn't budgeted for. He was a variable that didn't appear on any blueprint. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy-duty carabiner from his cleaning cart. He began to unscrew the gate, his fingers moving with a precision that was terrifyingly calm. He wasn't going to use a gun, not yet. To a man who knew the terrain, a gun was loud and clumsy. He looked at the guards one last time, measuring the distance, the timing, and the lethality required. The switch hadn't just been flipped, it had been shattered. Marcus Hale had stopped hiding. He began to unscrew the vent cover from the inside, his eyes reflecting the dull green glow of the emergency lights. The predator was out of the cage, and the cleanup was about to become very literal. Marcus slid back to his service cart with the silence of a shadow reclaiming its place. The two guards in the corridor above were elite, but they were trained for a specific type of war, one fought with lead and Kevlar. They weren't prepared for the periodic table. He moved with a clinical, terrifying focus. He reached for a gallon jug of industrial bleach and a heavy spray bottle of ammonia. In any other context, these were the fluids of hygiene. Combined in a confined, unventilated space, they were a death sentence. He knew the molecular math. Mixing the two would release chloramine gas, a caustic vapor that would melt the lining of a man's lungs before he could even register the scent of swimming pools. He began to work, his hands moving with the steady rhythm of a man preparing a gourmet meal. He soaked a series of heavy-duty microfiber rags in the mixture, sealing them into airtight plastic liners to concentrate the fumes. He then took a bottle of high-gloss floor wax, the kind designed for maximum slip on marble, and began to coat the threshold of the stairwell door. He applied it in a thin, invisible sheen, creating a frictionless kill zone that would turn a tactical advance into a catastrophic fall. Next, he pulled a pressurized canister of degreaser from the bottom rack. He modified the nozzle with a piece of plastic tubing from a vacuum attachment, creating a makeshift delivery system that could spray a fine, flammable mist over a 10-foot radius. He wasn't just a janitor anymore, he was a combat engineer using a $3 billion building's own maintenance supply as his armory. Marcus checked the master clock on the wall. The terrorists were moving toward the server farm on level 3. They were efficient, but they were loud in ways they didn't understand. They were moving through a world he had mapped by touch and smell. He took a heavy industrial floor buffer, a 60-pound beast of steel and rotating pads, and positioned it at the top of the darkened service ramp. He loosened the safety pin on the handle and wedged a spray can of pressurized air into the trigger. It was a kinetic trap, a low-tech battering ram waiting for a tripwire. He looked at the chemicals, the wax, and the heavy machinery. To Farid al-Zahir, these were the trinkets of a servant. To Marcus, they were the components of a nightmare. He had spent years trying to be clean, but as he twisted the cap off the last bottle of solvent, he accepted the grim irony. To save the people in this building, he would have to get his hands very, very dirty. He felt the vibration of footsteps through the floor, vibrations that didn't match the rhythm of the security patrols he'd memorized. The hostiles were coming. Marcus stepped back into the darkness of a supply closet, the door clicking shut with a sound no louder than a heartbeat. He didn't need a rifle. He had chemistry, gravity, and the total lack of a conscience when it came to defending his territory. The air in the hallway began to change, the sharp, stinging scent of the chloramine gas starting to seep from the vents he'd rigged. The first wolf was about to step into a trap designed by the man he'd ignored for 5 years. The cleaning shift had officially begun. The first operative moved with the overconfidence of a man who believed he owned the darkness. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a suppressed carbine held in a tight low ready, his night vision goggles pushed up onto his helmet. He didn't see the thin, invisible sheen of floor wax until his lead boot hit the threshold of the service corridor. The physics were instantaneous. The guard's center of gravity vanished, his legs scissoring outward in a violent, uncontrolled slip. In the world of high-stakes tactical combat, a quarter of a second is an eternity. It is the difference between a successful trigger press and a catastrophic failure. Marcus Hale lived in that quarter second. As the guard's body tilted back, Marcus stepped out from the shadow of a recessed alcove. He didn't use a knife, he didn't use a gun. He held his industrial mop handle, a 6-foot shaft of reinforced aluminum, in a wide, two-handed grip. Before the guard could even draw breath to shout, Marcus drove the heavy, sodden head of the mop directly into the man's face. The weight of the wet fibers, heavy with the stinging scent of bleach, acted like a soft-tissue hammer. It blinded the operative and yanked his head backward, further disrupting his balance. In the same fluid motion, Marcus pivoted, using the mop handle as a lever. He hooked the end of the shaft behind the guard's lead knee and pulled with the explosive force of a man who had spent decades deadlifting equipment. The operative hit the floor with a bone-jarring thud, the air driven from his lungs in a wheezing gasp. His 416 Hong Kong dollars clattered against the linoleum, sliding away on the waxed surface. Marcus didn't hesitate. He dropped the mop and closed the distance in a blur of blue fabric. He didn't strike with a fist. He used the palm of his hand, a short, piston-like strike to the man's chin that rattled his brain against his skull. The guard's eyes rolled back, his body going limp before his hand could even reach for the sidearm on his thigh. Marcus caught the man's head before it could hit the floor, preventing the telltale crack of skull on concrete that might alert the second guard further down the hall. Marcus stood over the unconscious man, his breathing shallow and controlled. His heart rate hadn't even climbed above 80. He looked down at the mop, now stained with a smear of blood from the operative's nose. For 5 years, he had used that tool to erase the presence of others. Tonight, it had become an extension of his own lethality. He reached down and recovered the guard's suppressed rifle, checking the chamber with a practiced, thumb-press movement. The metallic click was the only sound in the hallway. He felt the weight of the weapon, the cold, familiar geometry of the bolt carrier and the grip. For a fleeting second, the cleaner felt the predator try to take full control, urging him to hunt, to clear the entire floor with lead and fire. But Marcus took a slow, deep breath, smelling the sharp tang of the chloramine gas he had released earlier. He set the rifle aside. A gun was a signature, a loud declaration of war. He preferred to remain a ghost. He dragged the unconscious guard into the supply closet, stripping him of his comms and his master keycard. He looked at his watch. 1 down. 7 minutes until the next patrol rotation. To the men upstairs, time was moving in minutes and hours. To Marcus, it was a series of quarter seconds, each one a window where a janitor could become a god. He picked up his mop, dipped it back into the bucket to rinse away the evidence, and moved back into the shadows. The basement of the Pentagon was never intended for human comfort. It was a forest of insulated pipes, thrumming transformers, and thick concrete pillars that held up the weight of the nation's defense. In the flickering light of a failing overhead ballast, 3 administrative staffers huddled against a damp wall, their faces pale with the realization that they were no longer people, they were leverage. Omar Kadim, Al-Zahir's second-in-command, stood 10 feet away. He held his rifle with a casual, one-handed grip, his posture exuding the bored cruelty of a butcher waiting for a slow blade. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was looking for compliance. He didn't hear the sound of the janitor's cart because Marcus had abandoned it 2 hallways back. He didn't hear the footsteps because Marcus was no longer walking on the soles of his boots. Marcus watched from the darkness behind a massive industrial chiller. He didn't feel a rush of righteous indignation or the hero's spark that the movies promised. Instead, he felt a cold, analytical stillness. He viewed the scene as a tactical problem to be solved, a mess that required a specific kind of solvent. He wasn't there to save them out of the goodness of his heart, he was there because Omar was a contaminant in his workspace. One of the hostages, a young woman in a torn blazer, began to sob. Omar took a step forward, the muzzle of his rifle rising toward her chest. "Silence," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. Marcus didn't wait for the trigger pull. He didn't shout a warning. He moved from behind the chiller with a speed that defied his age and his plain navy blue uniform. He didn't come as a savior. He came as a predator. He used the environment as a weapon before he even touched the man. Marcus reached out and yanked a heavy brass release valve on a high-pressure steam line running along the ceiling. With a deafening shriek, a wall of scalding white vapor erupted between Omar and the hostages. The sudden roar and the heat acted as a flashbang, shattering Omar's focus and blinding his thermal sensors. Before the steam could even dissipate, Marcus was inside the cloud. He didn't use a gun. He used a heavy-duty, floor-scraping blade, a 6-inch wedge of sharpened carbon steel he'd pulled from his belt. He struck Omar from the side, a low-angle entry that bypassed the ceramic plates of the man's tactical vest. It wasn't a duel, it was an execution of technique. Marcus's movement was a blur of blue fabric and cold steel. He gripped the barrel of Omar's rifle with his left hand, redirecting the weapon toward the floor, while his right hand drove the scraper blade into the soft gap of the operative's underarm. Omar gasped, the sound lost in the hiss of the steam. He tried to pivot, to use his superior reach, but Marcus was already behind him. He transitioned into a rear-naked choke, not to put the man to sleep, but to use him as a shield while he scanned the exits for more hostiles. He held the dying operative with a terrifying lack of emotion, his eyes darting across the room with mechanical precision. The hostages stared, paralyzed. They didn't see a hero. They saw a man in a janitor's uniform who had just dismantled an elite soldier in less than 3 seconds with a cleaning tool. The way Marcus stood, back straight, chin tucked, eyes like flint, frightened them almost as much as the terrorists had. "Get to the maintenance tunnel behind the transformer," Marcus said. His voice wasn't warm, it was a command, hard and metallic. "Don't look back. Don't stop until you hit the steel door with the yellow stripe." As the staffers scrambled away into the dark, Marcus let Omar's body slump to the concrete. He didn't check for a pulse, he knew exactly where the blade had gone. He wiped the scraper on his jumpsuit, the blood a dark, spreading stain on the navy blue fabric. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a hunter, and the basement was now his kill floor. The Pentagon was built as a series of concentric rings, but for Marcus Hale, those rings were merely a suggestion. He knew the hidden geometry, the negative space, between the walls where the infrastructure breathed. He stood before a nondescript service panel in the level 3 corridor, his fingers moving to the heavy master key ring at his hip. The ring was a relic of a dying era, a collection of physical steel teeth in a world of digital swipes. He selected a jagged, short-milled key and slid it into the manual override. With a sound no louder than a settling house, the panel popped outward. Inside was a vertical crawlspace, a lightless shaft filled with the hum of high-voltage cables and the dry, recycled taste of forced air. Marcus didn't hesitate. He stepped into the narrow void and pulled the panel shut behind him, disappearing from the world of cameras and motion sensors. Al-Zahir had secured the hallways with thermal tripwires and claymore mines, effectively turning the corridors into a series of death traps. But Al-Zahir was an operative who thought in 2 dimensions. He understood floors and ceilings, but he didn't understand the veins. Marcus climbed. He used the horizontal support struts of the HVAC ducts as ladder rungs, his movements measured and silent. His navy blue uniform was quickly coated in the fine, gray dust of decades, but he didn't feel the grit. He felt the building's blueprint in his mind, a three-dimensional map where every junction box was a landmark and every ventilation grate was a tactical overlook. He reached a primary junction where 4 massive air return ducts converged. Below him, he could hear the rhythmic clack-clack of boots on tile. He pressed his face against the steel mesh of a vent. 10 feet below, a 2-man fire team was sweeping the server room entrance. They were moving with precision, their weapons raised, checking every shadow. Marcus watched them from 3 inches away, separated only by a layer of thin steel and the fact that he didn't belong in their reality. He was the ghost in the machine, a variable they couldn't calculate because he wasn't navigating their perimeter, he was bypassing it entirely. He moved further into the ductwork, his master keys chiming softly like a metallic heartbeat. He used a specialized skeleton key to unlock a damper, allowing him to slide into a lateral shaft that led directly toward the heart of the server farm. The space was so tight that his shoulders brushed the cold galvanized steel on either side, but there was no claustrophobia. In the dark, in the tightest spaces of the Pentagon, Marcus Hale felt a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. He wasn't slumping anymore. He wasn't hiding his strength to make others comfortable. In these tunnels, he was exactly what he was meant to be, a precision instrument designed to find a weakness and exploit it. He reached the final hatch. Through the perforations, he saw the dull, rhythmic blinking of the server stacks, the brain of the building. Al-Zahir was there, bathed in the eerie green light of the monitors, unaware that the ceiling above him was no longer a barrier. Marcus gripped the master key ring one last time, selecting the key for the overhead fire suppression access. The perimeter had been breached, not with explosives or a frontal assault, but with the quiet turn of a janitor's key. The wolf was focused on the door, never realizing that the ceiling was about to exhale a predator. In the heart of the server farm, the air was cold enough to see one's breath. Farid al-Zahir stood at the center of the hub, the flickering green data lights reflecting off his tactical goggles like the eyes of a deep-sea creature. He was comfortable here, surrounded by the hum of technology and the certainty of his perimeter. But Marcus Hale, perched in the dark geometry of the ceiling, knew the one secret the elite operatives always forgot. Technology is a parasite that lives on light and power. Marcus reached into the maintenance access panel, his fingers finding the heavy manual bus bars that controlled the floor's localized power grid. He didn't just flip a switch, he committed an act of surgical sabotage. Using his master key as a conductor, he bridged the gap between the primary and secondary breakers. The result was a violent, white-hot arc of electricity that lasted only a millisecond before the entire sector died. The transition was absolute. The humming servers went silent, the emergency lights flickered once and surrendered, and the green glow of the monitors vanished. Total darkness swallowed the room, a thick, pressurized blackness that felt heavy against the skin. Below him, Marcus heard the immediate, frantic rustle of gear. Night vision on. Al-Zahir commanded, his voice sharp but controlled. A moment later, the high-pitched whine of activated NVG tubes filled the silence. The terrorists felt a surge of confidence as their world turned into a grainy, luminous green. They began to sweep their muzzles upward, looking for the source of the short circuit. But Marcus had anticipated the green light. From his cleaning cart stash, he had retrieved 3 industrial-strength flares and a spray can of high-gloss reflective paint. He didn't drop a flashbang, he dropped a whiteout. As the first flare ignited, the magnesium bright light hit the reflective paint he'd smeared across the server racks. To men wearing sensitive light amplification goggles, the effect was like a physical blow to the retinas. A chorus of pained shouts erupted as the terrorists ripped the goggles from their faces, blinded by the chemical sun Marcus had birthed in the darkness. Now, the advantage shifted. The operatives were effectively blind, their eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden, pulsing void. But Marcus didn't need light. He had spent 5 years navigating these rooms by the feel of the air currents and the count of his footsteps. He knew the exact distance from the ventilation hatch to the corner of the third server rack. He knew the floor wasn't flat, it had a 3-degree slope for drainage near the cooling pipes. He dropped from the ceiling. He didn't land with a crash, he landed with the muffled thud of a man who knew how to absorb impact through the balls of his feet. He was a shadow moving through a black void, a ghost who didn't need eyes to see his prey. The terrorists began firing blindly, the muzzles of their rifles spitting tongues of flame that briefly illuminated Marcus's navy blue uniform like a strobe light. He was never where the bullets landed. He moved in the dead spaces, between the bursts of fire, closing the distance with the terrifying speed of a shark in midnight water. In the total blackout, the Pentagon had ceased to be a high-tech fortress. It had become a primitive hunting ground. Marcus Hale breathed in the smell of ozone and burned electronics, his heart rate steady, his mind a clear map of the carnage to come. The cleaner was no longer invisible, he was the darkness itself. The darkness of the server room was no longer a void, it was a weapon Marcus wielded with surgical intent. Farid al-Zahir was the last man standing, a silhouette of jagged edges and panicked breathing. He had discarded his blinded night vision goggles, his back pressed against the humming chassis of a mainframe. He swung his rifle in frantic, short arcs, the suppressed muzzle spitting, coughing, bursts of lead into the shadows. Marcus didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying patience of a man who had spent years watching floors dry. He stayed low, his navy blue uniform blending into the oily blackness, his footsteps silenced by the thin layer of cooling leak water on the tiles. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was the cleaner, and al-Zahir was the final, stubborn stain. The operative fired a burst that sparked off a steel pillar inches from Marcus's head. In the strobe-like flash of the muzzle, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Al-Zahir saw a man he had dismissed as furniture, but the furniture now had the eyes of a wolf. "Who are you?" Al-Zahir screamed, his voice cracking the professional veneer. Marcus didn't answer. He closed the gap in 3 explosive strides. As al-Zahir leveled the 416 Hong Kong dollars, Marcus didn't dive for cover. He stepped into the line of fire, tilting his frame just enough for the rounds to whistle through the fabric of his sleeve. He drove the palm of his hand into the rifle's handguard, forcing the barrel upward, and then he unsheathed his tool. The combat knife was a 6-inch slab of matte black steel, unpolished, utilitarian, and lethal. It was the only thing Marcus had kept from his former life, buried at the bottom of his locker beneath his starch and rags. The brawl was a collision of styles, al-Zahir's desperate, high-speed tactical grappling against Marcus's grounded, industrial brutality. Al-Zahir swung the butt of his rifle like a club, catching Marcus in the ribs with a sickening crunch. Marcus didn't flinch. He absorbed the pain, using the momentum to wrap his arm around the operative's throat. They hit the floor together, sliding across the wet linoleum. Al-Zahir reached for a sidearm, but Marcus was faster. He pinned the man's wrist with his knee and brought the knife down. He didn't go for a wild, cinematic strike, he moved with the economy of a man scraping gum off a tile. He drove the blade into the gap between the operative's collarbone and vest, severing the subclavian artery with a single, practiced twist. Al-Zahir's struggle went from violent to frantic, then to a rhythmic, fading twitch. Marcus held him as the light left the operative's eyes, his expression one of grim, tired mercy. He didn't hate the man. He just had a job to finish. The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus stood up slowly, his ribs screaming, his navy blue uniform now a mosaic of blood and grease. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his master key ring. With a steady hand, he walked to the manual override and turned the key. The overhead lights flickered, hummed, and surged back to life. The black void vanished, revealing the carnage. The elite operatives lay scattered like discarded rags among the high-tech server stacks. Marcus looked at his reflection in the glass of a server cabinet. His shoulders were no longer slumped. He didn't look like a ghost or a predator, he looked like a man who had finally stopped running from himself. As the heavy security doors hissed open and the first tactical response teams from the outside world burst in, rifles leveled and shouting orders, they found a man standing in the center of the room. He wasn't holding a gun. He had picked up his mop and was methodically pushing the gray, soapy water over the blood-stained floor. A general he had served coffee to for 3 years stopped at the threshold, staring at the bodies and then at the janitor. "Hale," the general whispered, breathless. "What happened here?" Marcus didn't stop his work. He moved the mop in a perfect, overlapping figure eight. "Just clearing the floor, sir," he said, his voice a soft, gravelly rasp. "Shift's almost over." By the time the sun rose over the Pentagon, Marcus Hale was gone, leaving behind a clean floor and a legend that would be whispered in those halls for decades. The cleaner had finally finished his work.